We're live. Hello and welcome to the Undisputed MMA show presented by the FTN Network. My name is Jonah Shiffman. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, John Kelly. We're going to be going over UFC Vegas 40 going down this weekend at the Apex facility. We're kind of on a run of these, a little bit of an underwhelming events, I would call them, by the UFC, but we have some really solid cards coming up at the end of the year. And despite just having 11 fights this weekend, and like I said, not a ton of name value on the card, this is low-key a week that I'm looking forward to, at least betting streets. And it's not an opinion I've held for the last weeks. I was kind of shitting on this card publicly, but John, my man, you've been like excited about this card for weeks. Tell me your thoughts, kind of how you're feeling going into this big UFC Vegas 40 slate for you.
I mean, I wouldn't go that far saying I've had it circled for weeks. I believe you served me my boot on Twitter for saying this was a decent betting spot. But yeah, I mean, you know, I'm never one to complain. Obviously, the card isn't great. Like, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, but these are the low level type of cards where we say it every time it comes around. Like, yeah, it's a low level card, but sometimes the low level fights are where the biggest edges are and the best opportunities to make a little bit of money. So hopefully we'll uncover a few of those over the course of this show and ready to talk fights with you. We got 11 fights this week to get into. So
yeah, we got 11 fights. Yeah, and it looks like it's gonna be more of a straightforward DraftKings slate. Recently we've had like a lot of late replacement sort of deal where we've had fighters underpriced, and we do have a late replacement who's actually not in the DK player pool yet, who is Lupita Godinez, who fought last week and is coming back to fight this week. She doesn't have a price on DK, but it feels like more of your like traditional 11 or 12 fight slate on DK as opposed to some of these ones we've been having recently where there's all sorts of, you know, pricing errors and late replacements that make for really interesting game theory, but I would not describe them as like your typical MMA DFS slate. So without further ado, let's just hop right into it here. Our first of 11 fights is a women's fight. We got Ariane Carnelossi as a -155 favorite here against Istela Nunes, I believe, is making her UFC debut, and she hasn't fought in about 3 years here, but she'll make her UFC debut as an underdog this weekend. The DraftKings prices are Carnelossi $8.5 thousand on DK, and Nunes comes back at 7.7K. John, I will let you kick things off here because I am not usually the one who specializes in the women's low-level fights, especially coming off of a long layoff, but I know you've made some plays on fights similar to this before. Any action for you on the first fight of the night?
Yeah, no action yet because still waiting on FanDuel to release those props. I feel like they might misprice some of the props here. So I don't know. We're just going to have to wait for it. But I think Carnelossi in general is one of those under machines that we've talked about in the past. Like, just her fighting style usually leads to a finish because for a couple reasons. One, defensively, like, she doesn't move her head. She doesn't block punches. So she gets hit a lot. But also she's just extremely powerful. Like, the girl's super jacked, super strong. She has like 9 career knockouts and she does hit hard. And when it comes to the grappling, like, I think she's a BJJ brown belt, but she's not like positionally sound. You know, you've seen her get reversed, give up positions like that. So she's just one of those like low level sloppy type of fighters. But we know those sloppy, high paced fights typically lead to a finish or typically lead to a decent DraftKings score. So that's why I always kind of get interested in her fights. And her opponent, Istela Nunes, people are betting Nunes, I've seen, and I don't really get it, to be honest with you. Like, I know she comes from a Muay Thai background, former Muay Thai champion. It looks like she has a little bit of pop in her punches, but I mean, she just basically looks like a one-dimensional decent striker. Like, I don't see anything special with her. And I just think Carnelossi's power and her physicality are going to be a big problem here because Nunes, like we saw in fights on the regional scene, like, she's getting ragdolled and thrown to the ground by girls who are like, I mean, I think 105. I think she had a fight at 105 or something back in the day. Like, she's going to be smaller than Carnelossi here. I think the power is going to be a difference, even though Carnelossi's not especially clean on the feet. I just think, you know, the power and the physicality are probably going to be the difference here. But in terms of the betting, I would probably wait and look to target a prop. Maybe take a look at an under 1.5, under 2.5 that you probably get a decent plus money number on. But we'll see. I mean, I guess the pick is Carnelossi, but it's not like a super convicted take.
Yeah, for me, I have no action on the fight. I think the betting markets have been pretty interesting throughout the week. At this point last week, we saw the price tag on Nunes closer to the plus 155 than plus 135 range. But she's taken some money. That line dipped a bunch. It's kind of coming back with some Carnelossi money now. People are buying the dip, certainly on the favorite. I just think it's tough to make a bet on this fight just due to the lack of data, right? Like Istela Nunes got signed to the UFC in 2019. She hasn't fought since 2018. She was in one championship. She actually fought a decent strength of schedule over there. Like she fought Angela Lee in one FC, which is a solid opponent for sure. But like, get signed by the UFC, USADA suspension. She's 29 years old. I mean, she trains out of ATT allegedly, which would be good for someone's development, especially like between the ages 27 to 29. Like that's a time when a fighter is still making improvements. But if you go look at her Instagram, like she doesn't appear to be at ATT, at least not in Florida. She looks like she's at a local gym in Brazil. At least that's where she's been for the majority of the pandemic. So I just don't really know what to expect from Istela Nunes. We had a similar situation a few months ago when Victoria Leonardo fought Gatto in that fight, and everyone was betting Victoria Leonardo, thinking like, look, this is this girl coming off a 2-year suspension who we don't know anything about. And now I feel like the narrative has kind of flipped, and people are like, well, Nunes probably made improvements. She's fought a decent strength of schedule, and those things are true. But for me, it's hard to make a fight when like the only data we have of Nunes in the last 3 years is like her hitting pads on Instagram. And the only pad hitting videos that I let impact me is when John DMs me videos of local Philly guys like Bill Algeo before his debut. I remember waking up and seeing that DM from John on Instagram. And I was like, all right, I guess I'm going to make a decision based on a 3-minute video on Instagram. But in all seriousness, like, no action for me here. I didn't think Carnelossi looked especially good in that Na Liang fight. If you guys remember, that was like the first fight back with fans at UFC 261. Absolutely crazy first round of that matchup, back and forth. And then Na Liang basically like was fully exhausted after 5 minutes, and Carnelossi was able to go out and get a stoppage in round 2. Low level fight for me. I'll sit back, watch, and hopefully be able to gather some information and make a bet on either one of these women moving forward. All right, let's move on to the second fight of the night. And I think this is a low-key banger of a fight. John, I know you have an opinion on it. I actually have a bet on the same side as you. In the match that we got, Danaa Batgerel here is a favorite, minus 165 against Brandon Davis, who returns to the UFC after putting together a nice little win streak on the regional scene following his original cut after being signed to the UFC and putting on some pretty entertaining fights. But Davis comes back, plus 145. DK prices here for Danaa Batgerel is 8.6K. Brandon Davis is 7.6 on the other side. And John, I'll let you kind of lead off here again because you got this bet in before me. I'm pretty sure you have a better price than me on the money line. So talk to me here. Why do you like the underdog in Brandon Davis?
Yeah, that doesn't happen often. I don't know. We might need to fact check that one. I don't know if I believe that. But Brandon Davis, yeah, this is a guy who, well, I think it's either 156 or 152.
Oh, I have 152. That'd be anticlimactic if we have.
You have 152? Oh boy.
I'll check it. I'll check it as we go. You give your breakdown and I'll check it. I'll provide.
No. I got 152 as well. I got 152 as well. So we got the same number. All right. Yeah, no, I've always been a Brandon Davis guy. Like even back in the day, like when he wasn't necessarily a good fighter, but he put on exciting fights. Like I always was rooting for this dude. And I was kind of bummed when he got cut from the UFC. I'm glad to see him get another shot here. Like he's not a bad fighter. And I just think stylistically, like he has the tools to make this a good fight, a winnable fight for him. Like Danaa Batgerel is a power puncher. We know that. Like he's got power in his hands. He's coming off 2 first-round knockouts, but I think he's just getting a little bit too much respect in terms of the money line here against Brandon Davis. People are like, oh, you know, he was cut from the UFC, whatever. And Batgerel just knocked out 2 guys in the first round. But I mean, outside of the power shot for Batgerel, I really don't see him having really any advantages here. And Brandon Davis is a guy who's historically been very durable. Like if you remember the Brandon Davis fights, like he's a guy who likes to get in there and bang. And he's very, very notorious for eating a lot of shots and then waving people in. Like he gets hit and he does the, like, come on, let's go.
Yeah,
like even after just eating shots like that, like he's super durable. I think he's going to be able to take the power of Batgerel here. And I just hope he goes to the wrestling because it's not something that he does a lot, But when he does do that, he has a clear grappling advantage over Batgerel. We've seen Batgerel take him down multiple times against Haile Alatang. That was I think the only fight he's lost in the UFC. And then I believe there was another fight where he was out wrestled as well. Like, and it's not that Davis never goes to the wrestling. Like, we saw him land multiple takedowns against Giga Chikadze. We saw him land a takedown or two in one of his other fights. Like, even though he doesn't always go to the wrestling, I feel like this matchup specifically, it's just such a clear advantage for him because he is the better grappler. I think he can land takedowns here. If he strikes, like, I still feel like plus 152 is playable. Like, his striking is not that much worse than Batgerel outside of the power advantage. So I just think he has the right tools to make this a dogfight here. And if he goes to the grappling, I actually think he'll look like a favorite here. So I like Brandon Davis. I played him at the money line for for a unit and a half at plus 152. And he's going to be a strong underdog underdog target on DraftKings as well.
Yeah, so I'm on the same side here. I know you got the bet in first. It was anticlimactic that we got the same line, but I feel like our feelings on the fight are relatively similar. You know, Brendan Davis, it feels like we're kind of getting a buy low spot on Brendan Davis in the aspect that, like, he was cut from the UFC, but if you look at his strength of schedule, I mean, he gets Chikadze, a win over Randy Costa, Enrique Barzola, who's over in Bellator now, but like, it's a really tough stylistic matchup for someone who's super long and likes to play an outside game. You're just getting grinded against the fence the whole time, and then obviously he fought Zabit, who is likely the best fighter he's fought. I know Zabit's kind of a forgotten man at 145 right now, but like, that is a top 5 fighter for as flawed as I think Zabit is. And for as much as I didn't think he had the same championship upside that people did kind of when his stock was at an all-time high, like, Brendan Davis has fought elite fighters in this weight class. And for me on the other side, you look at Danaa Batgerel. This is a guy who I cashed on against Kevin Natividad. I think he's good for what he is, right? Like, this guy is a power puncher who is there to kind of move forward, push a little bit of a pace, and he hits hard, and I'm not discrediting that whatsoever. But kind of historically, like, on the feet, you mentioned that you think plus 152 on Brandon Davis is a solid number, even if they stay standing. You know, I make Batgerel a favorite on the feet just because I think he hits harder. But like, Brandon Davis is not afraid to go to a full arsenal of strikes. This is a guy who he's only been outstruck at distance twice in his UFC career. And I know some people are super into UFC stats. Some people are not super into stats within the realm of MMA, but like, if you just look at his pure distance striking numbers, like, Zabit barely outstruck him in terms of volume. And when you watch the fight, like, Zabit clearly did outstrike him, but he's keeping it competitive on the feet with basically everyone. Like, there's nobody besides Giga who really blew Brandon Davis out of the water on the feet. And it wasn't even like Giga dominated him. Like, we've seen Giga go out there and knock out Edson Barbosa. And I know this is a guy in Giga who's improving, but like, Brendan Davis has been competitive striking, if not the better striker in all of his UFC fights. And then you add on the wrestling upside here, you know, Danaa Batgerel, only UFC losses to Haile Alatang. He lost that fight because he spent 3 minutes on his back in round 3. And I didn't love what I saw there. So to me, it's kind of a small favorite to Batgerel on the feet. I think Davis has the advantage if he looks to wrestle. To me, it's just kind of like a coin flippy fight. Like, bigger guy, more, I don't know what the word would be, like, more diversity in terms of his striking and a ground ability advantage here for Brandon Davis. I think he's a pretty good play. I got 152 for a unit. Not necessarily my favorite bet of the card, but certainly a spot that I feel like could be priced a lot closer. All right, let's move on to the third fight of the night. We got Ludovit Klein minus 375 here as the biggest betting favorite on the card, actually, against Nate Landwehr. Current betting odds are Ludovit Klein minus 375, Nate Landwehr plus 310. We take a look here. DraftKings prices Klein, most expensive fighter on the slate. Landwehr, $7K, least expensive fighter on the slate. John, what do you got for me here? Because Ludovit Klein is someone who we faded successfully his last time out, to the disappointment of some with that judge's decision for Mike Trizano. But I'm curious what you think here, because I'll say this: Nate Landwehr has not necessarily been impressive throughout his UFC run, but Ludovit Klein, I haven't really seen anything to make me think that he's worth being a 80% implied favorite almost at the UFC level against a competent guy like Nate Landwehr. So do you think this line is wide, or do you think Klein is kind of able to rebound and cover a big price?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to say that this line looks a little bit wide, but at the same time, like, I don't know if I'm willing to take a bet on Landwehr either, just because, like, the dude's super exciting. Like, he's willing to bite the mouthpiece, put on a show for the fans. But I mean, the defense isn't really there. The durability is not really there. Like, if he's going to fight like that against a guy who's super powerful, who does have a lot of finishing potential, especially early in the fight, then it's just a little bit concerning. So even though, I mean, I think the line's probably wide here, but I also think, like, I wouldn't be surprised if he just eats a knee in the first round and goes to sleep. Like, he's been knocked out twice, but he's taken a lot of damage over the course of his career just because of his fighting style. And I do respect the finishing ability of Klein. But I mean, at minus 410, I mean, there's no way. I don't think he's even parlay material, because Klein doesn't really have the cardio, as we saw, to go a hard 15. Like, I think Klein wins round 1 here at a big clip. I think he finishes in round 1 at a semi decent clip. And then I think the only path that Landwehr really has is he survives round 1, and then round 2 and round 3, not even so much round 2, really round 3 is where he comes on late. And then maybe gets like a close decision that goes his way. But I think more than likely he probably gets finished here. It's going to be a banger, though. It's going to be fun. I don't know if I'd want to take an overweight approach to Klein, just because his DraftKings price is so expensive. But we did see him go to the takedowns a little bit in his last fight. He does have that in his arsenal. But to this point, Landwehr shown some pretty good takedown defense. So I don't know if I'm playing him on DraftKings. I don't know if he's going to be a core target. Probably not. And in terms of the betting window, I'm probably just going to pass. I don't hate people if they're going to take like a half unit stab on Landwehr, just because the line did blow out here a little bit. But overall, it's going to be just a fun fight to watch for me.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on the line movement there, because it's been kind of interesting throughout the fight week. We are on Thursday afternoon recording a little bit earlier than normal. We're about, I would say, like 20 hours away from weigh-in, so hopefully nothing too drastic changes on this card. You never know. And you got Aspen Ladd in the main event after she missed weight at 135 2 weeks ago and was rewarded with the main event this week. But I'm glad you brought up the line movement, because it's interesting, because Ludovit Klein has taken a decent amount of money this week. We saw Nate Landwehr, you could have him at like plus 250 on Monday, Monday, kind of the beginning of the market starting to open up. We got limits raised a little bit, more people entering the market, and Ludovit Klein has kind of been one-sided aspect of he's taking money. And another side that's taking money that I actually agree with here is the under. The under opened limits at like under 2.5 minus 115. So essentially a pick 'em price in terms of the total market. And that's been steamed to minus 160, minus 170 in some places. That was the look that I wanted to take for this fight. I'm not going to end up betting it. I think the market has kind of corrected to a more accurate price at this point in time. I don't advocate for people to bet parlays on this show mostly, but I will advocate for people not to include certain fighters in their parlays. And I think Ludovit Klein is a really good example of that. You know, as controversial as his loss to Mike Trezano was, this is a guy to me who I just don't rate very high. Like, he's coming off of outside of the UFC, like a bunch of big head kick knockouts, like very taxing style. He's trying to hit you as hard as he can every single time. And we saw a new wrinkle in his game with the wrestling a little bit last time out, but I still think he has cardio issues. He's just a tough guy to lay a big price on. I would rate him at like 5 out of 10. Like, I think he's just a middle-end guy in the division who his wins will come like in highlight styles, and his losses will come in like, well, he almost had the highlight and then he got thoroughly, dominated for the last 6-7 minutes of the fight, kind of like you mentioned in terms of hitting a cardiovascular wall. Something that I think is most interesting in this fight is I just don't really rate Nate Landwehr that high. Like, he's a fun fighter. You talk about Brandon Davis calling opponents on, like Nate Landwehr, he doesn't just call them on. He's like screaming at them to come get in a firefight with him. And so while I don't rate either guy super highly, I think that Klein's best attribute is his power, especially via kicks, to get opponents out of there early. And I think Landwehr's kind of biggest flaw, despite the fact that I don't think he's a very good fighter, his biggest flaw is the amount of damage that he's willing to take. And that's just a dangerous game to play against a guy like Ludovit Klein. So passing in the betting markets here, I do think a live bet on Nate Landwehr, like this guy's still breathing after 5 minutes. I think he's live to win the fight, probably going to lose the first round. Like, I don't think that Klein minus 400 is an accurate representation for the entire fight in terms of the betting odds. But for round 1, I think he's like a minus 400 favorite, maybe even higher. So if Nate Landwehr is still alive, he's looking like he's still in the fight after 5 minutes. I wouldn't get like a half unit stab. We'd probably get like plus 400, plus 500 at that point on Nate Landwehr. So that's my favorite way to approach the fight. It's not a situation that I'm like eagerly awaiting, similar to the Jamie Malarkey spot a few weeks ago. Like, Jamie Malarkey, I was excited to live bet him. Here's just like, if Nate Landwehr's live, like this is a guy who's going to slow down against him, but it's not necessarily a spot that I feel super confident in the guy coming back, even if Klein was gas out. Right, that's 3 fights. Next up, our 4th fight, which is the one I'd mentioned off the top of the show that's a little bit wonky in terms of DraftKings. We have Lupita Godinez, who is making, I believe, the shortest turnaround in UFC history. I think Shimaev did it in 10 days during the pandemic. I think Godinez is now doing it in 7 days here. So she's coming fresh off of a win against Suarez in her last time out. She fights Luana Carolina. Betting odds currently have Godinez as a -235 favorite. Luana Carolina is +200 as the dog. So Carolina has a price on DraftKings. She's 7.2K, and that kind of reflects the underdog status she was against Sijara Eubanks, who I'm pretty upset that fight is not happening. The line was at like a -355 when Eubanks pulled out on Tuesday, and I got a good amount of money down on Eubanks -180 on some openers across the market. So definitely disappointed that fight isn't happening. But I think it's interesting where this line opened. We were having a discussion in the FTN Bets Discord. Our buddy Connor, who does a lot of DFS stuff for FTN, that Discord is free to join for anybody who wants to. Just go to ftnbets.com or ftndaily.com and hit chat. We're in the MMA channel, obviously. We were having a really good conversation about kind of where we thought this line would open. And my guess, at least, was Godinez -200, just because of the market respect we saw for her in her last fight. She opened like -600 there, immediately got bet down. Like the other side was smashed at that price. It was just a bad opener, basically. But the market has respected Godinez, and I think she deserves to be a favorite here against Luana Carolina. But she opened at -300. The early money is on Carolina, and honestly, I think that Carolina might be the side here, not necessarily someone who I'm excited to play. Not sure I'm going to make a bet on the fight. But Godinez, I mean, this is a big price, right? She's moving up in weight for this. She obviously had a fight camp because she fought last week. But like, I don't know about you, John, but if I went out there and won my first UFC fight, like I'd be eating good, like going out in Vegas the week after. Maybe Lupita Godinez was like waiting for this moment because she stepped up, immediately after Eubanks went down. So props to her for getting back in there on 7 days notice. She obviously took no damage last weekend, but it's just a big price for the smaller fighter. And Carolina's biggest weakness, man, is her grappling game. That's why I had bet Sijara Eubanks. I thought that Eubanks would really be able to carve through her on the ground. And while Godinez went to the wrestling her last fight and she won via wrestling, I think she had 5 takedowns within the first round there. Actually missed the beginning of the card last week live, so I rewatched it this week. She looked strong in that realm of the game, but we haven't seen Godinez like really go to her grappling consistently, and that is the only way I think she's really going to look like -200, -300 in this spot. So no action for me yet, but I would be careful kind of praying this price for Godinez. I think recency bias could be strong. We saw Bout Better in the chat mention that live on YouTube. I agree. I think recency bias is kind of playing a factor into this line. It's a pass for me. Carolina is not really a bet on fighter for me. She has a clear weakness and her strength isn't really enough to overcome that weakness. Like she's not going to really put out a ton of girls out cold. And I think she's going to get thoroughly dominated by any decent grappler in this weight class. But Godinez doesn't really belong in this weight class. I think she'll be severely undersized this weekend, and I'm just not interested in paying a -200 price tag. And as for DraftKings in this fight, I mean, it's kind of hard to make any real takes considering we don't have a price yet, but I assume Godinez will come out in the upper 8K price range. And for me, I doubt she finishes this fight kind of early the way she did her last time out. A lot of people remember her first round bonus last time on literally 6 days ago. So like for me, it just feels like I'm going to be underweight for Godinez in this spot. I'll pick her to win the fight, but not a spot that I feel comfortable laying any sort of chalk on. John, any take for you here on the short notice fight between Godinez and Carolina?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with a lot of the things you brought up there. I think I trust her a little bit more than you, especially in terms of DraftKings, because I do think if she does win, she does have that type of ceiling where it's going to come with multiple takedowns and potentially a finish on the mat. So I'm okay on the DraftKings. I'd expect her. They might just slide her right in at 9K where Sijara would be.
That's a good point. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's fine, but in terms of the matchup, like there are some concerns. It's funny. Our editor at FTN DK hit me up and was like, I saw she's fighting after just fighting last week. Like, is this like really unhealthy? And I'm like, well, I was like, in this case, not at all, because she won in 4 minutes. She took very little damage, probably takes more damage at like sparring practice. And she's moving up a weight class, so she doesn't have to do the same big weight cut again, So So there are reasons why, it's really not that big of a deal, but shout out to her for stepping up and taking the challenge on short notice. But Carolina, you mentioned the concerns. Like, Carolina is going to be a lot longer here. She has like a 6 or 7 inch reach advantage. She's a high volume striker, but I just keep going back to the defensive grappling. Like, she can give up the takedowns. I know her takedown defense, statistically speaking, is strong, but she hasn't really faced anybody that has any sort of decent takedowns. And you saw what happened against Ariane Lipski when she was taken down. The violence queen was able to get that knee bar, submit her in the first round. Like, I just don't think she's a very good grappler. And I think Godinez is going to close the distance and land takedowns. And Godinez boxing is clean too. Like, I know she's going to be the shorter fighter here. She's going to be at the reach disadvantage, but I just think she's going to move forward. We've seen Carolina get put on her back foot plenty of times. Like, I don't know. I don't want to pay minus 220, but I do feel pretty safe on the Godinez side, despite the short notice and moving up a weight class concerns. Like, I think she probably gets it done again. So I'm going to go with Godinez here. And I think she's an okay target on DraftKings. Not my favorite one, but I think she has a little bit more upside than maybe you gave her credit for.
Yeah, and obviously we'll be talking about that in the DFS Discord I mentioned on ftndaily.com kind of as the price comes out throughout the week. I think, John, 9K that you mentioned, the Eubanks price, I think that's a pretty good prediction for where Godinez might end up in terms of her pricing for this weekend. Last thing I wanted to say before we move on to the next fight, the UFC officially lists Carolina as 4 inches of height advantage here and 8 inches of reach. So certainly not an insignificant number, but like you said, I kind of expect Godinez to be able to close the distance and get this fight either into the pocket or on the ground at some point. So favor Godinez, but I'm not laying the price. It sounds like you're a little bit higher on her than I am in this spot. All right, let's move on to the next prelim. We got Ramazan Emeev as a minus 315 favorite here against Danny Hot Chocolate Roberts, who comes back plus 265 for Danny Roberts. The DraftKings prices for Emeev, 9.1K. Roberts is 7.1K. For me, this is just a fight that I don't have much of an opinion on. Ramazan Emeev is a guy who certainly doesn't put you on the edge of your seat watching him. He's kind of your traditional boring wrestler who kind of uses what people would call in our industry like the Russian coast. Like, he's very much like gets on top, doesn't look to pass a ton. It's just kind of looking to rack up control time. And props to the guy. I mean, it wins fights. He's 6-1 in the UFC at this point. And then on the other side, we got Danny Roberts, who I think is a more I'll call him a more exciting fighter. He's a little bit more of a dynamic fighter. I think he's the better striker in this spot, but historically doesn't have great takedown defense, has been taken down in fights before. Not necessarily a terrible grappler. Like, I don't think he's bad necessarily, but defense takedowns at 53%. We've seen him held down before. The Claudia Silva fight comes to mind. So I'm not laying the price on Ramazan Emeev. I'll say that. I think some of the big favorites this week are just kind of dangerous prices to pay. Like, Ramazan Emeev is a guy who wins on very thin margins. And what I mean by that is oftentimes he wins his fights, but it's hard for him to blow guys out because he doesn't throw much volume on the feet. And when he gets the fight to the ground, it's not like he's advancing consistently and making rounds easy to score for him. Like, I could see there being rounds in this fight, whereas like Emeev is on top for 3 minutes, but doesn't do much damage. And then they strike for 2 minutes and Roberts hits him with 1 or 2 kind of bigger punches, more damaging shots. So I don't mind taking a shot on Danny Roberts here. The only issue for me is I kind of see him getting taken down and controlled for large portions of this fight. I'm not sure it's that extreme that he's going to need a finish and can't win a decision, but his takedown defense historically has not really been to the point where I want to play him against high-level wrestlers. But I think price is pretty inflated at this point. I don't hate the Roberts shot. I'll pick Ramazan Emeev to win. He's a decent play on DK just because of the way they've updated the scoring system where control time counts for more total strikes count as opposed to significant strikes. Like, this is a guy who is not racking up a ton of significant strikes on the ground, but he'll get you those total strikes, which is really anytime you make contact with your opponent on the ground is a total strike scored on DK. And I think he'll rack up control time in this spot. I think he wins the fight, but certainly not someone I'm laying minus 315 on. John, any opinion for you here? Do you happen to like the underdog in Danny Roberts, or you think we see another boring Ramazan Emeev decision win?
Yeah, I don't really have a ton to add. I mean, I think it just comes down to the matchup for me because Roberts, he's going to give up the takedowns. He can't really defend takedowns, and we know Emeev's going to move forward. He's going to cage push, and he's going to look for those takedowns. So as much as everybody hates it and how boring it is, like, I just think the matchup is sort of tailor-made for his style to where he can land takedowns, ride it out in top position, and win a decision. So, and to your point, DraftKings, like since updating the scoring, like he's not the worst play because I am expecting some control time here. And if he does look the part of a minus 335 favorite, then we probably see maybe even like 10 minutes of control time here. We would definitely want multiple rounds of control time or potentially a finish. And Danny Roberts, I think someone said in the chat, like he's been finishing all 4 of his losses. We know the durability is not quite there for Danny Roberts. So even though Roberts, I think, is a better technical striker, I think he's more likely to find a finish on the feet. It's just, I keep going back to the takedown defense, the fight IQ, which is also a problem for Roberts historically. I just think the matchup is good one for Emeev. And the last thing I'll say is like, this feels like a classic spot where like everybody's like, Emeev by decision, Emeev by decision, Emeev by decision, because all of his fights are like that. And then we like randomly see him come out like a bat out of hell and like chasing a finish and then finding one. So everybody's like decision prop tickets get ripped up or something like that. You know, we've seen similar things like that play out with different fighters over the past couple of years. So no action for me, but I do think Emeev probably wins the decision.
Yeah, and I don't even know if it's going to be something where Emeev comes out like a bat out of hell and is just like really looking to like get the finish. But I could see a circumstance where like Danny Roberts is an all action fighter. Like that guy is not trying to lie on his back for 15 minutes. Like I could see him conceding like a super obvious rear naked choke position to try to get up because he's like frustrated being on bottom. So I think a finish, even for Emeev, would be more predicated on kind of Roberts's aggression. As opposed to Emeev kind of like suddenly switching up his style. But if he were to switch up his style, I wouldn't complain. You know, I love my wrestlers, but man, Emeev fights are like difficult to sit through. Yeah, we got the comment in the chat from William saying, if I bet Emeev by decision, he'll get a rear naked choke. Yeah, basically, like I don't know what the price is. I don't have it in front of me on Emeev by decision, but probably not something that I like want to sweat out when he has 15 minutes of top control here. So that's interesting. Let's move on to what I believe is the final prelim of the night. And it's another bet where, John, we got a boring show this week, man. We're like on all the same sides. We agree on every fight. There's no sort of beef or anything here. No disagreements. Last prelim, we got Bruno Silva minus 155, 8.3K against Andrew Sanchez, my guy, plus 135, 7.9K. This is the second fight where we were on the same side, John. I let you go first with Brandon Davis, so I'm going to go first here with Andrew Sanchez. And this is a spot where I just think that the line is almost backwards at this point. Like I am very high on Andrew Sanchez in this fight. I make him a favorite over Bruno Silva. Look, Bruno Silva is a guy who came into the UFC, fought Wellington Turman, who was a guy who I thought was going to be able to expose Bruno Silva for what he is. And Bruno Silva on the regional scene, or outside of the UFC, I should say, like this guy without a doubt is a big hitter, a lot of power. Some people will call him like a meme or whatever. Like I just think he hits really hard, but the rest of his game is really lacking, man. He's not a high volume striker, and his grappling is like brutal. And you don't need to just look like at his record. I know 5 of his 6 career losses have come via submission, but if you go back and watch his fights, man, like his getups are just not really there. Even his last fight against Turman, which I lost, and I've talked about on the show before how I'm not someone who like watches my fighters who I bet on and gets like super animated, super up or down or whatever. When it came to Wellington Turman in that fight, like when he got knocked out in guard via the hammer fist, like I literally, like when that was happening, I like felt everything slow down, and I was like, holy shit, like I can't believe I bet on this super fragile guy against this guy who hit super hard, and Bruno Silva. And it was one of those situations where like I don't even, my opinion of Silva didn't change. He got taken down by Turman, he held against the cage by Turman. Like I didn't think he showed any sort of improvements despite not fighting for 3 years due to a USADA suspension. I kind of just think he is what he is. And on the other hand, like Andrew Sanchez, to me, obviously coming off of a knockout loss to Mahmoud Muradov, I know he lost his last fight out to GM3. Shout out to my guy. GM3 cashing that plus 500 ticket for me in that fight. But like Muradov is a high level striker, and Sanchez just kind of wasn't able to take him down and struck with him. And I think he was drawing pretty dead there. And Muradov is a different striker than Silva in the fact that like a lot of his stuff is super technically sound. Like he's a very technically sound kickboxer as opposed to Bruno Silva, who I feel is kind of all power and less technique. And so what's concerning for me about Sanchez, and the reason why I'm not like all in on him this weekend, is like he didn't look to take down Muradov as much as I would like. Historically, this is a guy who's been able to kind of embrace the grind, take guys like Marc-Andre Barrios, who we know for being super durable, having good cardio, and Andrew Sanchez was just kind of able to drag the fight into deep water. Guy who's had cardio issues in the past, but seems to be kind of over them at this point. And I just think that if Andrew Sanchez is able to go to his wrestling in this spot, I think he's going to win the fight. And honestly, on the feet, I think that the stand-up is close, man. I think that Andrew Sanchez's jab is super good. He's a decent counterpuncher as well. I think if they were to kickbox for 15 minutes, Bruno Silva would hurt him at a pretty high clip. Like, the guy certainly does hit hard. I'm not trying to discount him. But, man, I think Andrew Sanchez top 25 at the very least, probably top 20 on a good day, potentially top 15 guy at this weight class at middleweight. I just think that like him as an underdog to Bruno Silva, who we've seen 4 minutes of inside the octagon, and it didn't even look good for most of those 4 minutes. I just think the price is totally crazy, and he's getting some market support. Bruno Silva is. I bet Sanchez at plus 135 for 2 units. I actually had bet him previously at plus 120, and I thought it was on FanDuel Sportsbook. That's where I tracked it, because that's where the price was available. And so I tracked him at plus 120. I had him at plus 120 on a different site. So I bet him at plus 135. I went to I points bet, and then I went to go cash out my FanDuel bet, and I realized that I didn't have him on a book where I could cash out. So I was just like completely like, I'm up to my neck Andrew Sanchez tickets this week. I have 2 units on him officially, but like I'm a big Andrew Sanchez guy this weekend. I'm picking him outright to win the fight. I think he kind of styles on Bruno Silva, assuming he doesn't get knocked out, which obviously there's somewhat of a decent chance of that. But I thought it was interesting that there's 2-way market action in this spot, because I know myself and a bunch of people whose opinions I value are on the Sanchez side here. Moving to AKA, I know, John, you'll likely touch on that in your breakdown. You are one of the people whose opinions I value that is also on the Andrew Sanchez train. I hope I didn't steal all your thunder. Talk to me about kind of why you're backing Sanchez. Is it, I assume, for similar reasons that I outlined?
Yeah, it's funny, you know, the Brandon Davis underdog shot that we're both on, we both bet the same number. This one, you said you bet plus 135. Hat tip to you, because I bet it at plus 134. So you got me there. But yeah, I mean, honestly, like this one's a no-brainer bet. Like, I think that's why we see so many people on Sanchez as an underdog here, is because it's like, you can't convince me that Bruno Silva should be the favorite in this matchup, and certainly not a minus 155 favorite. And you know, it's a lot of the same reasons. Like, I was on Turan as well. And a lot of this, like if you were on Wellington Turman against Bruno Silva, I feel like Andrew Sanchez should be an auto bet for you. Like you can't convince me. If you bet Turman against Silva and saw how that fight played out, how would you not bet Andrew Sanchez here? Like, it doesn't make sense. Like, Andrew Sanchez is arguably better than Wellington Turman in multiple areas. Certainly the wrestling, we saw Turman able to close distance, land the takedown. Like, Turman was executing the game plan that we wanted him to. It's just that the chin is just so much dust at this point that he got knocked out in guard, like you said. And it's kind of funny because we're using a similar fighter in Andrew Sanchez, who has the wrestling, has the grappling, decent striker, but also has the durability concerns. He's been knocked out 4 times. I do not think that it's to the level of Wellington Turman.
I was going to say, I cast a big bet on Andrew Sanchez knocking Wellington Turman out cold on like his 10-punch combo. So let's just put a little more respect on Andrew Sanchez.
Yeah, and I'm not saying it's the same, because Turman is like a guy like James Vick who could sneeze and knock himself out. Like, I don't think Andrew Sanchez is that level. Like, I think Andrew Sanchez, a lot of times, like, he just, especially earlier in his career, like, he would just go balls to the wall in terms of the output, and sometimes fall in love with his hands, where it's like, dude, you have a big wrestling advantage. Like, just use your wrestling advantage. And that is a little bit of a concern here. Like, if he does decide to just try to box for the first round, like I'd be okay with him striking outside of the first round. I think Bruno Silva probably hurts him in the first round if he tries to strike with him for the duration of the round. Like, he has to go to the wrestling, take some gas out of his arms. Like, Silva doesn't have much cardio, despite the kind of fluky win that he had against Turman. Like, I think that's really his path here, is like, he has to win by knockout, and it likely has to come early. I'm going to take the guy with much more experience, who's much more well-rounded, who has a clear wrestling advantage in Andrew Sanchez, even if I don't know for sure if he's going to go to that wrestling right away. I think, like I said, plus 135, it should be pretty much a blind bet at this point, just in terms of the skill set. Like I got to back Dirty Sanchez here. So I'm with you. He's another good underdog to target on DraftKings as well. So yeah, I'm riding with Sanchez with you.
Yeah, last thing on this fight. First of all, I just want to echo the DK play. I think he's one of the strongest underdogs on DraftKings. I think one of the most interesting things here is I saw a discussion earlier on Twitter this week about like regressing your takes to the market a little bit. And what that means, at least like a personal example for me, is when Pitbull fought AJ McKee in Bellator. And I was like, I had Pitbull as a massive favorite, but the market clearly didn't agree, right? Like if the market makes the fight 50-50 and I make a fight 80-20 in my head, like should I be regressing to the market that's taking everyone's dollars in? Like should I average out my 80% and the market's implied 50% for fights? And honestly, I think sometimes you do have to do that. But Bruno Silva is an example of somewhere where I don't regress to the market because I think the market is so wrong on him. Even if we look at his last two fight sample, we saw him fight Wellington Terman. That's a fight we've talked about a lot on this show in this breakdown so far. But like he closes a minus 125 favorite against Wellington Terman. And not to get like all MMA mathy here, but like Andrew Sanchez is like 2 times better than Wellington Terman. Like he knocked him out cold, better than him literally everywhere. It just makes no sense that what we saw from Bruno Silva wasn't impressive as a minus 125 favorite. And now he's fighting a better fighter, a better version of the fighter he just beat. And he's minus 155. So as Jack Shepard once said, I think we got to go back to the island here, John. I'm fading Bruno Silva once again. Hopefully it'll come through. And if not this time, maybe it'll come through next time. But it sounds like we're both on the same side here as our favorite underdog of the week. Certainly excited to see how that one plays out. Let's move on to the main card here. We got Julian Marquez as a favorite over the Beverly Hills Ninja, everyone's favorite nickname in MMA, Jordan Wright. Current odds have Marquez as a minus 260 favorite. Jordan Wright comes back plus 220 as the big underdog spot. Marquez 8.8K, Julian Wright is 7.4K. And this is a spot where I'm not ashamed to admit, I kind of just missed the boat betting Julian Marquez. Man, I talked about it to you privately last week. I thought minus 184 was hanging at FanDuel. That was a bettable price on a guy like Julian Marquez, who honestly, I don't rate Julian Marquez as a great fighter. He's a guy who doesn't win a lot of minutes. I think of the Maki Pitolo fight where he was down 2 rounds to none, most likely, and then came back and kind of was able to will a win back. It wasn't like a total, what we would call like an ass pull. Like he didn't just come out and like randomly get a finish down 2-0. Like he really dedicated himself, like knowing the opposite of what happened with James Krause and Tim Elliott last week, where we saw Tim Elliott was likely in a 1-1 fight, and James Krause of Glory MMA told him, hey, you're up 2-0, and it led to big problems for Tim Elliott, where he ended round 3 on his back. The opposite kind of happened with Julian Marquez, who also has James Krause as his head coach, where he was told like, hey, you're down 2-0, you got to go out and get a finish. And he hunted it, and he got it in that Maki Pitolo fight. So I think Julian Marquez is like a pretty elite finisher at 185 pounds. I'm not sure how good of a fighter he is in terms of winning minutes. And that's why I hesitated to lay the price at minus 185. And now minus 260 market wide, it's easy to hindsight be like, wow, I really should have pulled the trigger. But he's just a guy who I struggle laying big prices on. The only thing is here, Jordan Wright is very similar, where I know he gets a lot of shit from the nickname and like he fought so many cans. I do think he has like legitimate UFC level finishing ability. Just his skill set is really lacking. Like I think his grappling is below average. His striking has the ability to finish fights, but not to the point where I think he's like going to win a ton of minutes. So to me, these guys are kind of a similar version of one another. I just think Marquez is a much higher level guy. So I think it's a high variance fight because both guys can come out balls to the wall. The under 1.5 rounds is juiced here. I think it's a fight you certainly want to target on DraftKings. We talk all the time about how, wrestlers score the best on DK in the current scoring system consistently. But what has the biggest correlation with a ceiling score, obviously, is a knockout in round 1, where you're getting 90 points for the bonus in round 1, likely getting 10 points for a knockdown as well, plus whatever strikes you have leading up to the finish. So there's a super strong correlation, obviously, between early finishes and ceiling performances on DK. And I kind of think we see an early finish from either side this weekend. I'm picking Julian Marquez. I think the betting odds are about correct, but not a spot where I'm really comfortable laying minus 260 because I kind of think these two boys are just going to go to war, and we'll see what happens when they clash on Saturday night. Any take from you here, Jon and Marquez versus Jordan Wright?
Yeah, when you first mentioned like Marquez minus 180 or whatever, my first thought was I don't want to lay juice with Julian Marquez, but then like after looking into the matchup, it's like, it probably does look like value outside of, Wright finishing him in round 1, because I think that's Wright's really only path to victory here is Wright is going to move forward. He's going to be aggressive. He has, technical kickboxing skills. He does have some power. I think he's a black belt in jiu-jitsu as well. Is that correct?
Marquez?
I could be. No. Jordan Wright.
Jordan Wright. I mean, hypothetically, I haven't really seen like black belt level jiu-jitsu from him anywhere before. I don't pay a ton of attention to belt ranks, to be completely honest, but like I need the guy to prove it to me in like an MMA setting. But like Jordan Wright is certainly like a capable grappler, right? Like he fought Gabriel Checo and like avoided submissions in that fight and like looked somewhat decent. I mean, I know Checo's not like a great win to have or anything like that, but like he's fought decently credentialed like BJJ guys in the past and hasn't been like a fish out of water.
Yeah, and Marquez is a decent grappler too. That's why I bring it up. But I want to say maybe it was the Pickett fight. I thought there was a little bit of grappling exchange in that one where you could tell Wright looked like he kind of knew what he was doing.
He killed Pickett in like a minute though. It was like 50,
it was early.
Yeah,
but I just think that's his path to victory is like he hurts him on the feet and knocks him out, or it's a club and sub type scenario. Like that's really the only way Jordan Wright wins. So even if you like, we see it all the time. Like I'll never understand when people are like take the dog shot on Wright and bet him at the money line. Like I don't get that because I don't think he can win a decision. Like he doesn't have the cardio. Like we see it in all of his fights. Like he can't really fight outside of the first round. So I think if you are targeting him, just bet him by round 1. Like that's the best way to do it. Or like you can bet him by knockout. That's plus 500. Knockout in round 1 on FanDuel is plus 1100. Like that would be the way to target Jordan Wright if you're going to. But outside of him making it, a high variance war in the first round, I think he wilts over the course of 15. And Julian Marquez, historically very durable, which is why I did not take the shot on Jordan Wright in the first round. As much as I love the Beverly Hills Ninja, like Marquez has been in there with some really big, tough dudes, and he has a cast iron chin. Like I don't think he's going to get knocked out here, and I favor him pretty strongly as the fight goes on. So I think Marquez probably finds a finish in round 2 would be my guess. But like you said, this is a good fight to target. I expect the winner to score well. If you're playing 10 or more lineups, like I typically do, then I would say get exposure to both guys because Wright's going to be significantly less owned. But I think maybe like a 7-3 split or something like that on a 10 lineup build would be pretty good there in favor of Marquez. But I'll say Marquez by finish in round 2.
One last thing, I think your point about Jordan Wright only being able to win inside the distance makes a lot of sense. So you could obviously approach that by playing right inside the distance at an inflated number, like you mentioned. Another market that I want to put people to is the DraftKings decision-only market, where it refunds if the bet voids if there's a finish from either side, and it pays out if it goes to decision. And Julian Marquez is only a minus 150 favorite in that market currently, which kind of implies that they think Jordan Wright is more likely to win a decision than he is inside the distance. And to me, I think that's probably wrong in this spot. Shout out to Get Ya Cleats, who's in our bets Discord at FTN Bets. He mentioned that play for Marina Rodriguez last week, and I'd even mentioned on the podcast how I didn't think Mackenzie Dern could win a decision in that matchup. And I'm not trying to victory lap because I bet Mackenzie Dern by sub and I lost that bet. But there was great value on Marina Rodriguez at like minus 150 to win by the decision only market last week against Mackenzie Dern. I think it's an interesting look this weekend with Julian Marquez because Julian Marquez, you look at this guy, he's never won a decision before. But Beverly Hills Ninja has literally never been to a decision before. Like Marquez is 0-2 in decisions. Beverly Hills Ninja has 14 fights. He's never seen the judges' scorecards. Like I favor Marquez's cardio. I think he's the better fighter. I think that is a decent way to approach this fight. You don't want to lay a minus 260 in high variance spot if they bang it out. But if we see or a conservative of Marquez, which I don't expect, right? Like this fight is minus 400 or so to go inside or to finish inside the distance. Shout out to friend of the show, Z's MMA. He got like minus 250 on that. Super great bet by him. But like, I don't think the fight is going to hit the scorecards, but if it does, I favor Marquez at much more than a 60%, like that odd, like those odds imply. So DraftKings Sportsbook exclusive, but if you're interested in that look, I think it's not a bad way to attack the fight. let's move on to the second fight of our main card. This fight was scheduled to go down a few weeks ago. I can't remember whether it was scrapped after we recorded our show or beforehand. There's so many fights. I think we're in a stretch of like 9 or 10 consecutive UFC cards, so they all kind of blend together in my head whether we talked about them on the pod. But nevertheless, this fight is happening this weekend. Hopefully, we got Manon Fiorot, minus 235 favorite here, 8.9K against Mayra. Bueno Silva, who comes back plus 200, 7.3K for Silva. Jon, do you remember if we had talked about this show on the pod? I should have gone back and listened, but I can't remember if we've already covered it on the show.
I think we did, but it might just be because I wrote it up in my article. I could be getting that confused. But I want to say we did, but either way, I mean, we can hit on the main points of the breakdown as well.
Yeah, let's do that. Do you want to go first here for our third to last fight?
Yeah. So I like Fiorot here. I think this is actually going to be a banger. You know, both of these girls have power. You know, clearly on the Fiorot side, like we see that in all of her fights. Most of her wins are by knockout. She looked really good against, who did she fight in her debut? Was it Leonardo?
Yeah, I think she
Leonardo.
Man,
I've lost so much money on Victoria Leonardo.
Yeah, and then she beat our girl. We don't speak about that. Her second UFC fight against Tabitha Ricci. By the way, I don't know who the girl that Ricci is fighting in 2 weeks. I haven't taped it yet. I've literally I don't think I've ever heard of her. She fought on Contender Series against Maria Rodriguez.
It's next week, right? Next week.
Yeah, next week.
I think 23rd. Yeah.
Regardless, Tabitha's minus 200. She's getting a dub. She's getting the first dub, and I better see her in a parlay for you. We got to parlay her, no matter what.
I'm probably chasing the props, parlaying, hitting the money line, all of it, baby shark all the way. But yeah. So what was I saying? So Fiorot, obviously the power is very clear. She looks pretty dangerous in terms of her ceiling in this division. I just don't think many fighters in this weight class are going to be able to withstand that pressure and that power. And Bueno Silva is kind of similar. She's a power puncher as well, very powerful. The thing is why we were kind of wanted to fade Fiorot coming into the UFC is because we had questions about her cardio and we had questions about her grappling. And it's not that she's really answered either of those questions. It's just that I don't even know if it's going to matter with some of these opponents, and it hasn't yet. And with Bueno Silva, on the Fiorot side, the cardio is still a question. On the Silva side, it's not a question. We know she doesn't have good cardio. She's breathing heavy after one round typically. I don't think and I know her power is she does carry her power for a couple rounds if she needs to, but the cardio, I think she clearly slows down. You see it. She starts telegraphing a little bit more. She's a decent grappler, but she doesn't really look to land takedowns, at least not as much as she should. So even though she probably has a grappling advantage here, I wouldn't be banking on her to be able to go and land takedowns against Fiorot, who's very physically strong, who's very good in the clinch. I just think Fiorot does a lot of what Silva does well. Fiorot's able to combat that with a lot of the same skill sets. So I like Fiorot here. No action for me, but I think she's a pretty solid DraftKings play just because I think the winner of this fight probably finds a finish, and I think it comes on the Fiorot side. So I'd say Fiorot by knockout, probably round 2 or round 3.
Yeah, I'm interested in looking at what the under here is. If you think so minus 110 I see is the best market price currently for it to end inside the distance. So not a massive edge if we think it's close to 50-50. But I think your breakdown here was strong. And we did talk about this fight on the pod because while you were talking about the questions we had about Fiorot, it reminded me of what I said last time out. And that's I think I'm ready to adjust some priors on Manon Fiorot. And what I mean by that is she's someone who I seriously doubted coming into the UFC. Yep. And like you mentioned, it's not like she's answered the questions regarding cardio necessarily, although she's pushed a decent kickboxing pace for, over a round and a half. Obviously, a fight's 3 rounds, but this is someone who has legitimate finishing upside in women's MMA at 125 pounds. But what I will say is we haven't seen her defensively grapple, but we've seen her offensively wrestle a little bit. And I've been impressed by that. Offensive wrestling and defensive wrestling are not necessarily always symmetrical. Fighters who have great offensive wrestling are not always great defensively and vice versa. But when you go back and watch the fights on the regional scene that had me concerned about Fiorot off of her back, that was not a fighter who was going to be able to land the takedown she did against Ricci and Leonardo. And I know that Leonardo now is kind of out as like just this total trap at plus 200 because she's experienced and is fighting these newer fighters and then just like gets worked. And I know that I'm not trying to bring it up because I know that we have lost bets on this podcast in that fashion before with Leonardo. And I know Ricci is undersized, but just watching the offensive wrestling of Fiorot, there's no way that she would have been able to do that in the previous fights that have given me pause considering her defensive grappling. So I think this is a fighter who, while we haven't necessarily seen it in terms of her takedown defense, she's defended, I think, 2 takedowns in the UFC, but like I mentioned, not great competition. I think that she's probably improved. I would make a bet that she's improved a good amount in that facet of the game. And the best part for her here is she's probably not going to face takedowns because Mayra Bueno Silva is someone who has struggles defensively wrestling as well because everyone tries to take her down. And the truth of the matter is that Silva hits pretty hard, but I think Fiorot, like you mentioned, is just way stronger. She's the bigger fighter here too. I mean, she's an inch bigger, 1 inch of reach, but she fights like she's very big for the weight class. Like she extends super well at range in the kickboxing exchanges. I think she's super strong in the clinch. Like I think that Fiorot might just be a better version of Bueno Silva. And even though she's not going to take her down and kind of go with the normal route that we've seen Bueno Silva beat by historically, I think Fiorot is the deserved favorite in this spot. Not laying minus 200, but I wouldn't be surprised if she covers that price tag. I think she deserves to be a decent sized favorite this weekend at UFC Vegas 40. All right, let's move on to the featured bout of the night. And this is one that I've kind of struggled with all week. We've been talking about it in the FTN Bets Discord because Jim Miller is a minus 230 favorite here against UFC debutant Erick Gonzalez. Comes back plus 195. DK prices are Miller 8.7K and Gonzalez is 7.5K. What's interesting about this fight, like I was mentioning, is Jim Miller is a decent sized favorite at minus 230. But the under 2.5 rounds was like plus 135 to start the week, plus 145. And this is a guy in Jim Miller who his last win that did not come inside the distance was in November of 2016. So that is like just under 5 years ago. It's like 59 months ago at this point. Oh, maybe way more than that, actually. No, maybe 59. I shouldn't try to do math on the fly like that, but yeah, I do believe
it's 59.
Like, yeah, it's like 59 months ago the last time this guy won a fight. And it's not like Jim Miller hasn't been fighting. I mean, shout out to this guy. Like most UFC appearances, he has 21 wins inside of the UFC octagon. Like Jim Miller's been around. And we have a decent sample on this guy being first round or bust really recently. And we have a fight where he's a massive favorite and the fight is favored to end by decision, which doesn't really make sense to me just kind of conceptually. So I've been thinking all week about how I want to attack the spot. I put in a bet this morning. That was actually a tale of you. I should let you go first here, John, because you got it on it before me. But I bet Jim Miller by first round submission at plus 700 on FanDuel Sportsbook. I bet it for a half unit. I mean, you go back and just look at this guy's record, and some people would say like this is wiki capping and frown upon it, but like if you go back and watch Jim Miller's fights, this is what all of them have been. Even his losses against Vince Pichel and Joe Selecki, it was like he is a first-round submission or bust. His last 4 wins have come via submission in round 1. Of his 21 UFC wins, 9 of them have come via submission in round 1, and that's a pretty decent clip. And then we can literally math it out on the show here. So obviously this isn't totally predictive, but if 9 of your 21 wins have come via submission in round 1, that means like 43% of Jim Miller's wins have come inside of round 1 by submission. He still has that farm strength in round 1, like Dan is commenting live on YouTube. So if his wins come 43% by submission in round 1, and then you add on to the fact that when you strip away like the VIG on the line, he's like about a 65% favorite, probably a little bit bigger. I don't have the math in front of me. He's like almost 30% to win by submission in round 1 here. And obviously that isn't like a perfect metric, but I think you could even argue that the number should be higher than that when we add on the stylistic matchup where Jim Miller is even more a first round submission than he was in his prime. This is a guy who has dealt with like Lyme disease outside the cage. There's clearly some like outside forces that don't allow Jim Miller to have a ton of firepower outside the first round. And then you add on the opponent here in Erick Gonzalez, who is, first of all, he's not very good. Like I went back, I haven't seen his last 2 fights, but I had watched his fight against Humberto Bandenay, and like you get out wrestled by Humberto Bandenay, you're a pretty bad grappler. He's lost via submission a few times in his career. Rafa Garcia, who was minus 300 in the UFC, out grappled him pretty heavily in that fight. Like Erick Gonzalez is probably going to get taken down in the first round here. And I think Jim Miller is going to go all out for the submission. So I hope I didn't steal everything you wanted to say here, John, because you kind of originated the play. But that number on FanDuel is just like a must bet. And I don't love going more than a half unit. And limits were kind of low. I wasn't able to get down like as much as I wanted to. if I wanted to bet more than a half unit on this fight. I think the limits were like between $400 and $500, which for most people is like totally fine. So I'm happy giving it away as a play, but I think it could be worth even more than a half unit. Like I could literally make the case that Jim Miller by submission round one should be like plus 300 here. And we're getting a plus 700 number. So obviously betting props like that is high variance, but I think there's a pretty solid edge here mathematically on Jim Miller by sub one. I know you're on the same play here, John. I'll let you go first on the last two fights since I stole your thunder, but if you have anything to add, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, no, that was great. You know me, I love a good A10 breakdown. Jim Miller's my guy. We've been doing this for a year and a half almost. And you know as well as anybody, like I'm gonna bet on Jim Miller. It's just what I do. It's part of my brand. And this is no different here. Like anytime Jim Miller has had like a significant step down in competition, like he's won against some legit guys, but it's very clear when he gets a step down or if he faces somebody that doesn't have a sense of defensive grappling, like he's gonna showcase his grappling skills, and they just can't hang with him, and that's what it is. Like this guy Erick Gonzalez, like I've seen all I need to see from him to know that Jim Miller by submission in round one is value. Plus 700 is what I played. I played that for half a unit as well, but I already have a full unit on Jim Miller by submission at plus 290, which I think is also valuable because say it doesn't happen in the first round, and I think it does, but I think he gets it done in the second round. Like Jim Miller, former NCAA wrestler, like he's clearly probably the best wrestler that this dude Gonzalez has faced, and he's been wrestled multiple times on the regional scene by guys that don't have half of the wrestling credentials as Jim Miller. And Jim Miller, obviously a high-level black belt. Like I just don't think he can hang. This dude's been sub twice in the first round on the regional scene. Like if Jim Miller lands a takedown, Jim Miller, he doesn't even have to land a takedown. Like he could just Imanari roll, like just force some sort of grappling exchange. Like I do not think this dude can hang with Jim Miller on the mat. So like I said, I played the submission prop for a unit at plus 290 and then half a unit by submission at plus 700. I do think he gets the sub in the first round. I think it's pretty clear, and it's not like the lock of the century. Like there are concerns with Jim Miller. He is old, obviously. He's 38 in terms of fighting years. I'm not too far behind him, but in terms of fighting years, he is old, but he's still competitive. Like he won round one against Joe Selecki, like who's a high level grappler that we just saw recently. Like I just think this is like so many levels below him in terms of the grappling that it's like plus 700 for a submission in round one is crazy. Like that's like what, 12 or 13% implied. Like you said, I said in when I added it to the tracker, I don't think you can make this line. Like I would have made this line at worst plus 500. And even at that line, I would have bet into it.
I would have bet it
like
too.
You said, I think it would be playable to like, or a plus 350, plus 400 is probably where I'd be like, but like I said, I mean, I think the submission in round one is pretty clear. That's his path to victory. I mentioned there are some concerns. Like he did just have COVID a couple weeks ago, a month ago, whatever, had to pull out of his last fight because of it. But if anything, that just proves that he's going to go out there and chase a finish in round one, even more so. He's a guy that's historically struggled with the whole Lyme disease thing. Like outside of round one, he does start to fade. So it's like he knows his path to victory is an early submission, and he's going to go out there and teach this dude Gonzalez a vet lesson. So he's going to cash that sub round one ticket for the whole team this week.
Yeah, I hope so. I wrote in the FTM bets track, I post all my plays there, obviously. And I wrote the cutoff point was like plus 400 is the point that I wouldn't play Miller sub one, kind of below that line. And I'm usually even pretty conservative with those estimates because I don't want people like chasing super tiny edges in a volatile sport like MMA. So I think there's like a lot of room to play this. And if your units are either smaller than what I'm betting, or if your units are to the point where you're more comfortable in having more than half a unit on kind of like a narrow path to victory thing like this, which really isn't even that narrow, like I think you could go bigger than a half unit here is I guess what I'm trying to say. Last thing on this fight, because I know we are on the same side and we're just kind of echoing one another, but one thing I love that you mentioned is like Jim Miller has come through when he's a favorite in the past. Like he's come through in the spots he's supposed to, and this is a guy who has the most UFC appearances ever but he has not earned a ton of market respect. Like, you go through his odds history, man, he's been an underdog to basically everyone. Like, he's lost his last 4 fights. He was an underdog. Again, Holtzman, Roberts, he got the upset, obviously. Michelle and Select, he got out grappled. But then you look at, like, going back, there's a strong correlation between this guy being favored and him winning. And obviously that's the case for a lot of fighters, but there's a massive sample of it at this point. Last time he was a favorite, Clay Guida got him out of there in round 1. Before that, Jason Gonzalez got him out of there in round 1. Then he lost to Charles Oliveira, but like, he was plus 300 in that spot, obviously. One is an underdog over Alex White. But if you go back, the last time that this guy was a favorite, so he's a favorite twice in 2019 against Guida and Gonzalez. You go back to the last time that this guy was a betting favorite was 2016 against Gomi, and he knocked him out in the first round. Like, Jim Miller historically is not a favorite very often, but when he is, he's a guy who capitalizes on the opportunity and kind of gets guys out of there early. So really like this Jim Miller sub 1 spot. Might even add more than a half. We might go 0.75, get a little dangerous this weekend, but I like A10 this weekend. I'm jumping on the train. John, a train you're used to being on, but I'm hopping on for the first time in a long time. So hopefully we cash these bets. All right, let's move on to the co-main event of the evening. We got Andrei Arlovski against Carlos Felipe in a fight that the line's been flipping mostly throughout the week. At this point, we have Arlovski kind of an even money underdog in most places, plus 100. Felipe minus 120. DK prices are Arlovski 8.2K. Felipe is a flat 8K. And John, since I stole your thunder last fight, I'll let you go first. Any thoughts on our heavyweight co-main event in this spot?
Yeah, this is like my least favorite fight on the card, so I appreciate that.
I'll let you get the main event too, the high-level main event.
No, I just like to bust you when you say stuff like that. But I really actually don't have a strong take on this in all seriousness. Like, I just think these guys are kind of similar. Like, I obviously think this fight plays out on the feet. Like, I don't think either guy's going to look to land takedowns here. I think we see a competitive striking match. It's lined as a pick. I think that's appropriate. I think earlier in the week, you saw Arlovski at slight plus money. That's where it's a little bit interesting, but I probably wouldn't bet him unless he was like plus 140, something like that. Then I'd take a stab on him. I do think he's probably, like, the experience is going to be a factor. I do think maybe he's a little bit more technical in terms of the striking, a little bit more diverse, because Felipe is pretty much a one-dimensional boxer. But the problem I have, or not really a problem, but the concern I have is, like, Felipe has swung judges' opinions in close rounds just based on optics. And I think that's going to be a factor here. Like, as much as people hate it, like, we've seen it in like every single one of his fights. Like, even and a lot of his rounds are close competitive rounds. Like, I expect this to be against Arlovski. And in those close competitive rounds, I could see judges edging Felipe because he probably lands the more powerful shots, and he's going to be the one who's pressing forward. Every time the dude gets hit, he shakes it off. So maybe judges are like, oh, well, that didn't hurt him. Like, just because he shakes off every strike, and then he's just, sort of similar to Landwehr, like talking shit in there, screaming, whatever. Like, he's going to be the one with better optics. So it's like, I could see this one being a split where one judge has it like 30-27 one way, and then 29 the others have it 29-28. Like, this is going to be one where I think judges have it all over the place. I think Felipe maybe by split decision, even though I think Arlovski is probably the side. It's just not a fight that I'm looking to get involved with. And in terms of DraftKings, it's going to play out on the feet. I don't see grappling. I don't really see a finish either. So it's going to be a fade for me on DraftKings. I don't think either guy really has much of a ceiling.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned kind of the totals market there, because that is where what I think my biggest edge on like a non-prop is on this card. I really like this fight to go the distance. I bet it at minus 154 for a unit and a half on FanDuel. And honestly, man, like, I think I probably should have bet it for more because we talked a little bit about regressing your kind of like takes to the market at point. And so when I went back, I looked at a sample, I believe from the last 5 years between Arlovski and Felipe. Their fights go to decision like 83% of the time, which is well over a minus 400 spot. And then you even go further than that, and you look at the guys that are like, they're getting finishes over. Carlos Felipe has 2 career knockouts over fighters with winning records. Most of the guys he's knocked out are like 0-1, 0-2 on the Brazilian regional scene. And then you look at the guys that Arlovski is getting finished by. There's like Tom Aspinall, Jairzinho Rosenstrike, tied to Ivasa, took him to a decision. But then if you look at that before then, like these are all elite guys, and it's more than 5 years ago at this point. Stipe, Overeem, Josh Barnett, Francis Ngannou. Like, of course, these guys are knocking out a 35-year-old Andrei Arlovski. But when you look at the stats, even including those, and it's like an 83% go the distance rate, I regress it to the market a little bit because, it's heavyweight. Arlovski is over 40 years old. There's a chance that he just falls off a cliff at 42 at this point. They're swinging 4-ounce gloves at each other, but no matter how much I try to regress it to the market or how much I try to like skew my own data to the point of like, oh, a finish could happen, I can't get anywhere close to this being like 35% to 40% to be finished inside the distance. I just can't get anywhere close to that number. I think it goes to decision. Like, I don't want to say at a 75% rate because that's like minus 300, but like I think this line should be in like the minus 250s, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was like minus 275. I think that could be accurate. I think this fight goes to decision at a massive clip. I know that Arlovski's been knocked out 11 times in his career, but like I mentioned, like those were against guys who are way better than Carlos Felipe and way bigger knockout artists than Carlos Felipe. Say what you want about Felipe, and I've got a lot of things to say because I lost that bet on Jake Collier last time out. But like this guy just does not have a ton of knockout power, no matter what you think of the decisions that have gone his way or gone against him. Like the closest finishing sequence we've seen in his fights is when he was on bottom against Sergey Spivak. And I don't really think Andrei Arlovski is going to put him on his back. Like I'm pretty confident in that. So I think they're going to kickbox, really box for the entirety of the 15 minutes. It should be relatively high paced. They're swinging 4-ounce gloves. I'm not saying it's like a lock that someone doesn't get randomly knocked out, but I feel pretty strongly that this fight ends up going the distance. So a 1.5 unit bet for me at minus 154, still available market wide. I see a minus 190 at DK, still minus 164 at FanDuel. So I would hurry to FanDuel Sportsbook to get that number, but I still think a minus 190 is playable, man. Like a lot of people are scared to play fight goes the distance at heavyweight. But I made a lot of money betting Andrei Arlovski, and I made a lot of money betting Andrei Arlovski overs historically, and it's a spot that I'm pretty comfortable going back to here. Last thing, just on the money line side, I'm picking Arlovski to win. I just think he's fought a stronger strength of schedule. I think he's displayed that he's a better volume boxer. But you've mentioned kind of Felipe he's historically had the judges kind of in his pocket due to his optics moving forward. I would bet Arlovski if he got to like plus 110. I'm not looking to have a ton of exposure to the fight. I already have a good amount on the goes the distance. So I think the total is better than the money line, but I will pick Arlovski. Last thing we'll mention is this is a fight where if you do have a hotter take than mine or John's kind of on the money line, I really advise you to go price shopping out there because you can bet Carlos Felipe at plus 100 at BetMGM currently, which is a little bit off market. Or if you like the Arlovski side, he's minus 103 at PointsBet right now. So make sure you're getting the best price out there because you can get close to even money on either guy. And some books have like minus 120 for one side. And obviously 20 cents of value is an important thing to have when betting. So I urge anyone who has a stronger money line take than mine to really do their research, shop around, get the best of the number, and good luck. I hope the split decision goes in your favor. All right, let's move on to the main event of the evening. We got Aspen Ladd as a minus 130 favorite here, 8.4K on DraftKings against Norma Dumont. Dumont comes back plus 110, 7.8K in her first UFC main event. And John, I promised I'd let you go first here, but like I don't even know if you want to go first. Like, is this the main event you like? Don't like? Do you have a take on the fight? Like, what? I guess I'll let you go first. I won't even give you the option of getting out of it. I'll make you go first here. Aspen Ladd misses weight at 135 2 weeks ago, gets rewarded in a main event against Norma Dumont, who is like the most B-side of B-sides against Holly Holm in terms of like the UFC trying to push the fight. Like no one is tuning in to watch a Norma Dumont main event. Like the main event against Holly Holm was a brutal scheduling error even to begin with. But like people were tuning in to watch Holly Holm. And I know you're making that face because you're tuning in to watch Norma Dumont 56. But what I'm trying to say is like when they're scheduling the bout, like people know who Holly Holm is. I mean, I cannot imagine a casual UFC fan this Saturday afternoon tuning in to watch Aspen Ladd versus Norma Dumont. But we're here to talk about it. We get paid to talk about it. And hopefully we'll be able to make some people a little bit of money on the fight. Any take from you here, John, on the thickest main event of the year, I'll say.
Yeah, I mean, you say people aren't tuning in to watch this fight. I mean, they want to see the cheeks, man. Norma in there in the main event. Give her some shine. But yeah, in terms of the matchup, I mean, I kind of think Aspen Ladd is just a better version of Norma Dumont. They do a lot of things similarly. I do favor Dumont's striking a little bit just because Aspen Ladd has those defensive liabilities. You know, she does tend to get hit a lot. But it's just one of those things where I think Lad's probably better everywhere else. And I definitely think the clearest edge for Lad is in the cardio. Not that Norma doesn't have great cardio or even good cardio. I just think it's okay. Like we've seen her slow down in some of her fights, whereas Aspen Ladd, I think if this fight does get extended, that's where I really favor Aspen Ladd. Like I think early on, it's going to look very close. I think it's lined about right now. Early on in the week, I was like, man, they had Ladd as a pick'em on some books. I think FanDuel had it like last week. I would have loved to jump in on Ladd there. And I still would have bet her at -110. I still would bet her, but I don't think it's as good as I thought coming into the week, just because there are some concerns with Aspen Ladd. Like she did have multiple knee surgeries. She's been off for about 2 years. You mentioned the struggles with the weight cut just 2 weeks ago. I know she's moving up now in weight class. So the weigh-in may not be an issue. The weight cut may not be an issue since she's going up to 145 where she should be at. But at the same time, like she did just have a tough weight cut 2 weeks ago. I mentioned all the other concerns. Like there are some real concerns here, but I just keep going back to like, if the fight gets extended, and I do think it does get extended to like the third, fourth, even maybe the fifth round, that's where I really favor the cardio of Aspen Ladd. I think she takes over as the fight goes on. So even though I think it's competitive early, I think she probably starts to look the favorite, especially in the later rounds. So we'll go with Aspen Ladd. I do think it's a good fight to target in terms of DraftKings because I think both fighters can land takedowns. I think Norma Dumont is probably going to be more aggressive looking for the takedowns early if she maybe doesn't have the striking advantage like we expect her to. But I think over the course of 5 rounds, that's where I expect at some point Aspen Ladd to get on top. She has nasty ground and pound. I always mention her cardio because she's out there hiking in the mountains, 25 miles every single day with her dogs. Like if this fight goes 25 minutes, like she's going to be there. And I just don't think Norma Dumont is. So I'm going to go with Aspen Ladd. It's not the most confident read just because of all those red flags I mentioned, but yeah, do you agree with me? Are you on the Ladd side or are you taking a shot on thick Dumont here?
Yeah, I'm on the Ladd side. Not like a super strong take in terms of the money line. Didn't bet anything there. I did bet a total and a prop in this fight. So I bet under 4.5 rounds at +105 at the Superbook I think on Tuesday afternoon. That should be kind of available out there now. I think the line moved a little bit like to -110, but I still see a -108 at FanDuel on under 4.5 rounds. I think that's playable. I like the under in this spot because I think that Dumont actually has I think she has a pretty decent advantage at this weight class. And it's funny, you mentioned like Ladd probably should be at 145 for the long term. And while I don't disagree with that, her like previous weight cutting issues, I think that the issue with Aspen Ladd is like, she should be a 135er, man. Like she just can't make like she's not that big for 135. She's just like a little bit chubby, a little bit thick, but like her body type is not one that I think is really going to hold up at 145. And the only time we saw someone really fight like her size fighter was against GDR. And I know that was an early stoppage or whatnot. But she got nuked early in that fight, and she doesn't have great striking defense. I think that Dumont has a pretty considerable striking advantage in this spot. One thing that I disagree with that you said is I think that Ladd is kind of more likely to shoot takedowns throughout the entirety of the fight. I doubt we see Dumont really shoot on Ladd, and I think if Ladd gets the fight to the ground, she's going to be in pretty good shape. A lot of people bet Felicia Spencer against Norma Dumont, thinking that if the fight got to the ground, Felicia would be in good shape. There wasn't even an official takedown in that fight, and Felicia still got some top control time. I had no action there. I'm not totally like set on Dumont being legitimately good, and Aspen Ladd might not be good either, but I'll pick her to win the fight. And I know she gets a lot of shit for her ground and pound. Shout out to friend of the show, John, like the Martian on Twitter. I think it's at UFO_UFC. This guy like hates Aspen Ladd's ground and pound. It drives him nuts, like the way she screams on top. So if Aspen Ladd wins by ground and pound TKO this weekend, make sure you at our buddy Martian on Twitter and let him know how much you enjoyed the finish. But in all seriousness, I think that's the most likely outcome the fight ends in. There's 6 outcomes, right? Either fighter by decision, either fighter by sub, either fighter by KO. I think Aspen Ladd by KO is overwhelmingly the most likely outcome here. I think she gets on top of Norma Dumont. I think she pounds her out gets the victory. So I got 4-1 on Fox Bet. That line has moved to 3-1. I know it was at 3-1 earlier in the week on FanDuel. It's still there, plus 300 on FanDuel, plus 300 on Fox Bet. I put a quarter unit on Lad by KO. That's kind of the last number I would play it to. I wouldn't really play it under plus 300, but I do think it's the most likely way that the fight ends. So full unit on the under 4.5 at a little bit of plus money for me. And then the Aspen Lad KO prop shot for a quarter unit. So that's my action on the main event. John, we did it. That's 11 fights going down. UFC Vegas 40. It is wild that we have had 40 events at the Apex thus far. I'm excited for these pay-per-views coming up. I know you're going to be at UFC 267 on Fight Island. I'll be in New York for UFC 268. So certainly looking forward to those kind of those bigger name cards. But I actually do think that this week provides a couple of good betting opportunities. And I hope we were able to outline those for the people. So if you have anything to add about any of the 11 fights we went over or the main event, I know you're excited about a comment made during the main event in our in the live YouTube chat. Feel free to do so. And after that, take us out of here, my man.
Yeah, I think we got to get out of here, man. We got to wrap it up. The chat's getting rowdy. You know, these guys are out of control. We got to get out of here. But to quickly recap, basically, if you just are tuning in now, we are going to continue to lose money fading Bruno Silva, and we're all betting Jim Miller by submission in round 1. But in all seriousness, guys, thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please do us a favor. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening on iTunes, leave that 5-star review. We definitely appreciate the support. As always, we'll have all of our content up at ftndaily.com and ftnbets.com. It's completely free, including all of our bets for each UFC card, including Dana White Contender Series and all the Bellator PFL bets that Jonah likes to do as well. It's on ftnbets.com, completely free for everybody. So please go check that out. That's it, guys. Good luck this week. I'm John Kelly. That's Jonah Shiffman. This is the Undisputed MMA show presented by the FTN Network, saying goodbye and good luck, and we will see you guys next time.